Chayei Sarah. We are in the last chapter of our patriarch Abraham's life, and it's a pretty challenging time. He's old and frail. His beloved wife Sarah has just died. His son Isaac is barely speaking to him after that near sacrifice incident. His other son Ishmael is quite estranged after Abraham sent him and his wife out. So tough times. Just 2 parshiot before, in Lech Lecha, Abraham was given such great, grand promises by God. I will make of you a great nation, and I am giving this land to your descendants. But here, at the end of Abraham's life, it seems these promises of land and more progeny are not quite fulfilled. And it's unclear to him if they ever will be. Abraham is wrestling here at this stage in his life with the very same questions we worry about today. Those buzzwords, Jewish continuity. Where will the Jews be, and will future generations be Jewish? I recently traveled on a mission to 2 cities at the center of these questions in Jewish Europe, Amsterdam and Paris. Now, Amsterdam has been a home for Jews, a large center for Jews, since the 16th century. After the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions, it was a major center for Jewish life. And before the Holocaust, 10% of Amsterdam was Jewish. Now, we visited the Esnoga, which is an extraordinary sanctuary built by the Spanish-Portuguese community in the 17th century. The architecture shows the self-confidence and the wealth of that community. When it was built, it was literally the largest synagogue in the world, and it was one of the largest buildings in all of Amsterdam. Today, they struggle to get 40 people on a Friday night. But the community proudly preserves their sanctuary, and especially Eitz Chaim, their Jewish library, which is the oldest in the world. We visited the Anne Frank house and walked behind the actual bookcase that hid the entrance up to the tiny attic where Anne and 7 others lived in secret and silence for over 2 years before being betrayed by an informant and taken to Bergen-Belsen. I was happily surprised to hear that this museum gets about 1.5 million visitors a year, the majority of them not being Jewish. There is regularly a 3-hour line of people willing to stand on that line to enter. We met with the museum director and their educational specialist, both of whom are not Jewish. We heard about growing anti-Semitism in Amsterdam and their incredible efforts to educate against all racism and all bigotry, and to spread the message of Anne Frank's resilience and her belief in the fundamental goodness of all people. We visited the Progressive Congregation in Amsterdam. This was the congregation that Anne Frank's family belonged to before the war. The community has invested in a new, large building they built 5 years ago. They are thriving with services, B'nai Mitzvah, educational programming, including an encounter program they have with Muslim students on the college campus right in their neighborhood to help forge greater relationships and understanding. So they left us with a hopeful picture. We then traveled to Paris, and in preparation for the trip, I read the article from Jeff Goldberg entitled, "Is It Time for the Jews to Leave Europe?" A very grim picture he painted of the state of Jews in Europe and in France in particular. And no doubt, things are quite hard there for Jews. France, with 500,000 Jews, is the 3rd largest Jewish community in the world, after Israel and the United States. But France's Jews represent less than 1% of the population, but it accounted for 51% of the racist attacks last year. We spoke with the head of the AJC in Paris, Simone Ben-Zaken. She said, "I feel very safe as a Jew in Paris." But when she was pressed a little bit more, she admitted, actually, she tells visitors not to wear a kippah when they're out in the streets. And then, she says, "And when I take a cab home from the airport, I just don't tell the cab driver I'm coming back from Tel Aviv. She admitted, I guess this is the new normal. We met with a prominent leader of a Jewish organization who feels that the public schools are not totally hospitable for his Jewish children, and he sends his son to a Catholic private school instead. And approximately a third of the Jews of France do the same. After the kosher supermarket massacre, his son said to his father, "We have to leave." When we asked him, "How did you respond?" he said, "We are French. We will resist. We will stay." Every single synagogue we saw, every Jewish center, the Holocaust Museum, they all had heavily armed guards in uniform in front. In some ways, it was kind of a reassurance because it was clear the government is taking this all very seriously. But it had the effect of making you feel like a target every time you walked into a Jewish institution. But even with all those troubling trends, we ultimately left with a sense of hope. We spent our Shabbat at the MJLF, a vibrant Reform synagogue led by a former Central intern, Rabbi Delphine Horveler, a powerhouse. She's one of only 2 female rabbis in the entire country. She and a colleague lead a congregation of over 1,000 families. And on Friday, we walked into a packed synagogue. Everyone was singing. The 2 rabbis graciously did their sermon first in French, and then they translated it into English for us. The theme of the sermon was how things get lost in translation. We couldn't have felt more welcome by them. And at the end of services, an adorable bat mitzvah girl, like the ones we see here, came up to help lead the Kiddush. She happens to be one of about 90 b'nai mitzvah they do in a year. What better sign of Jewish continuity than the promise of those children? So those are a few snapshots of Jewish life in Amsterdam and in Paris today. I felt so fortunate to bring a mission from Central, and the Jewish communities there felt so appreciative that we made a visit and our support. Now, Abraham, our patriarch, he worries about Jewish continuity, but he doesn't just fret and think about it. He actually does something. And in this portion, he buys a burial plot for Sarah, thereby establishing his first claim to the land. And he sends his most trusted servant to find a nice Jewish girl for his son Isaac, to help ensure that there will be future generations of Jews in his family. We know Jewish continuity takes work and effort, but I continue to be inspired by the ways Jews have fought to keep Judaism alive all over the world for centuries. Kol Yisrael arevim ze bazeh, all Jews are responsible for one another. Together we will help fulfill that covenantal promise that began with Abraham and Sarah.